A few weeks ago, I made a video where I took Marvel heroes and turned them into DC villains. And so today, we're doing the opposite. That's all the intro we're getting. I got really carried away with the stories. They run kind of long. Let's just get into it, shall we? Let's go. Hit like if you want. Subscribe if you feel like. But either way, enjoy the show. Odin spent many centuries as the Allfather, king of the realm known as Asgard. In that time, he was not always a benevolent ruler, and before his demise, he did all he could to cover up the darker parts of his reign. There was a time when he and his first child, Hela, took Asgard's armies on a rampage across the realms to conquer them all, but they were met with stronger resistance than either anticipated. While Asgard's might was irrefutable, other realms were not without their own formidable warriors. Off the back of multiple lost battles, Hela proposed an idea to Odin, one that, if he had been in a more confident and right mind, he would have refused. Using a blend of Asgardian and celestial magic, she proposed that they could raise the most powerful warrior the realms had ever seen to fight at the head of Asgard's army. They'd take a single Asgardian child and hurl them into the dreadful realm of eternal fire known as Muspelheim. The child would inevitably be killed by the demons that resided there, but using the blend of magic proposed, Hela could bring the child back over and over and over again, each time with a new invulnerability to whatever had killed them before. Slowly, as the child grew in agony and torment, they'd grow stronger and stronger and eventually be undefeatable. It was an incredibly cruel thing to subject one of his people to, but Odin was convinced by Hela that the child's sacrifice would be for the good of Asgard in the long term. She enacted this plan for the next 2 decades, using an Asgardian orphan named Altiam. His first few lives he spent bawling in fear and desperation for anyone to save him from the flaming torment he was in. But nobody came. The poor boy died hundreds of dreadful deaths, indeed, each time growing stronger, but also taking on the demonic form of the realm he was cursed to, and slowly he lost more and more of his sanity. By the time the child was grown and sufficiently powerful as Hela desired, she presented him to Odin, who was mortified by what he'd allowed, as the boy was now more monster than Asgardian. This was one of the many acts that pushed Odin to decide to cast Hela into banishment. He tried to have her creation executed, but it had become so powerful that no matter of gods thrown against it could defeat the beast. Altiam was then sent to the same realm as Hela, locked away from the other 9 realms. Altiam quickly grew vengeful in containment with Hela and tried to tear her apart. While she couldn't defeat the beast, she was able to conjure a containment suit for it, what essentially amounted to a full-body monster-confining straitjacket. Altiam then remained trapped, unable to do anything but writhe and think. His rage grew more and more over the years as he over and over again thought about how all he had wanted was nothing more than safety from the torture that Hela had subjected him to, and now he was still her prisoner, but in a different kind of hell. Eventually, though, when the Allfather passed, Hela could feel that escape from this prison they were in was possible. She was tempted to simply unleash the beast unto Asgard as revenge, but she also wanted to rule the realm, so instead she transported the creature, still in its containment suit, into a cavern in the depths of Midgard on Earth, where she could return to unleash Altiam if she ever saw fit. Time passed, Hela was defeated, and all Altiam could do was thrash in his suit underground. But with Hela dead for long enough, the might of her magic faded, and the suit finally tore open. With the slightest rip, Altiam could smell his freedom and began to thrash as violently as was possible. After a week, he tore his arm free, and from there the rest was ripped away with ease. Shrieking in rage, he tore his way through the earth until he reached the surface, ready to unleash centuries of pent-up rage. He stormed through mountains, tore any animals he saw apart, and eventually made it to a city. With his impossible, beyond godly might, Altiam destroyed full skyscrapers in a single blow and just continued to cry out in rage for Odin and Hela. Heroes of the world came, but none could stop the monster, though hearing the name Odin, they knew who to call. From across the galaxy came Thor, who told the creature that Hela and Odin were dead, but that Thor was their relative. And that seemed to be enough for Altium. Altium unleashed his impossible rage against Thor, who held his own for some time, with his mighty axe Stormbreaker keeping him almost on par with Altium. But eventually, the tormented beast was able to pin Thor with his own weapon and smash the hero's head into the pavement over and over. Altium was about ready to finish Thor off, desperate for it to bring him some kind of peace. When ringing through the chaos and rage, Altium heard a child's cry. He looked through the smoke and swirling ash of a city in flames to see a small, terrified child calling out for help. Altium heard the voice as if it were himself in those treacherous days in Muspelheim. The building right next to the boy was beginning to crumble, and the boy was paralyzed in terror and fear. Altium leapt away from Thor, grabbed the child, and carried it off to safety, where it then ran, still in fear of Altium. Altium then looked back across the burning city and realized he'd just brought the same pain he'd been trying to alleviate within himself to thousands of other people who'd done nothing to him. He left Earth soon after and simply sat on the moon for some time, pondering what to do next. Altium had only known rage and sought vengeance for so long, but now those he'd wanted to kill were gone, and seeking further vengeance from their heirs could only bring about more pain. Eventually, he sought out other worlds, gaining intelligence and experience as a savior, dedicated to defeating those who would bring pain in any way even remotely similar to what he'd been subjected to. Eventually, he'd even seek out Thor, who did recover after quite some time, to apologize and to explain why Altium had sought to kill Odin and Hela. Thor threw around a few lines about being off his game that day, and how he probably could have won if at his peak, but beyond that, he accepted the apology, and told Altium that, if he so desired, there was a home for him on Earth in New Asgard. From there, Altium would even fight alongside Thor and many other heroes of Earth and beyond, to eventually himself become one of the mightiest heroes in all the 9 realms. Caitlin Snow had always been obsessed with the cold. Perhaps it was nominative determinism, having a last name reflecting the most iconic element of winter, but she'd always loved the frigid weather and tingling sensation of touching a smooth, icy surface. Her obsession was eventually even enough to get her interested in studying thermodynamics, the physics of temperature and its relation to energy. She grew up to become a leading expert in the field and even got a job for Stark Industries, trying to develop ways to use thermodynamics to create alternative renewable energy, similar to the arc reactor. Luckily, this was something Stark Industries had already been studying and experimenting with in an isolated Alaskan laboratory, where their lead scientist had just tragically died after venturing out and being caught in a treacherous storm. Snow wasn't grateful for the scientist's death, of course, but did fully embrace the opportunity and flew out to the lab to meet her new coworkers. They all seemed a bit standoffish, but Snow just took this as them still being in mourning for their coworker, though none of them seemed to speak very highly of the deceased. After a few months of work, Snow was able to finish the self-sustaining thermodynamic ultraconductor engine, which, on their few calls, Stark had simply simplified to the acronym STEW. Snow was ecstatic with her success and ready to call and set up a final meeting with Stark to show him the device in action, but then the internet went down, as did the cell service. When Snow was about to take this to their IT head, the security of the lab grabbed and restrained her. That was when her coworkers revealed that all of them were actually from Advanced Idea Mechanics, or AIM for short. They were a group that sought power through technology to use as a way to gain control over various governments of the world. The last Doctor had realized the infiltration, and they'd had to take her out of the picture because of it. But they still needed this device finished. Now, AIM intended to steal the engine and use it for their own means, and that meant first, getting poor Caitlin Snow out of the way. While they were distracted, monologuing at her, Snow was able to grab one of the guns from her captors and hit him over the head. She then ran, unwilling to shoot someone, and hid inside her own machine. Unfortunately, they quickly discovered her location and turned the engine on. They assumed she'd quickly be killed, but instead the unpredictable new energy transformed her body, with the heat and cold both becoming intrinsic parts of her being. She emerged from the machine with her whole body now pale blue, with frost emitting from her. She felt freezing, and not in the way she'd once so enjoyed. The agents tried to simply shoot her, but the bullets pinged off her icy flesh. She then grabbed one of them and noticed that the heat from their body warmed her greatly, and yet simultaneously seemed to elevate her ice powers, causing blades of ice to emerge from her arms. She then latched both hands onto the man's head and pulled all the heat from his body. She felt fantastic, but he dropped dead. Even she was then scared of what she'd just done, but upon seeing it, one of the AIM agents hurled a grenade at her, which she simply ducked around, but it flew past her, exploded, and destroyed the machine she'd worked so hard to build. Her already ample fury grew, and she stormed through the site, sucking the heat out of every single AIM agent, killing them all before finally stopping and realizing what she'd just done. Snow was terrified of what would happen when people found out what she was and that she'd just killed so many people, even if they were criminals. She could argue self-defense, but she didn't even know if that was totally true. She could have stopped short of killing them. She'd finished them off out of rage. She knew eventually others from Stark Industries would be seeking an update, so out of fear, she just fled the site. She marched for days through the Alaskan wilds, slowly feeling the cold more and more, eventually coming across a bear and draining its heat to keep herself moving. She even lit fires in the woods to warm up, but for some reason nothing was able to warm her like draining the heat from those AIM agents. She eventually made it to a small town and kept herself covered in a hood and mitts as she used various modes of transportation to get back to her home in New York. It was approaching summer and she hoped the natural heat of the season would warm her. But no luck. People stared at her walking down the streets in a full parka while others were in short sleeves, but she ignored them, too focused on the terror of what was going to happen to her. Luckily, she'd be pulled out of her thoughts as she heard people running and screaming around a city corner. She moved closer to investigate and saw a group of short, yellow, semi-humanoid creatures running from a jewelry store with mounds of diamonds and gems in their claws. For a moment, she thought this was perfect. She ran towards them, hurled off her coat, and grabbed the nearest one. The creature snarled and clawed at her, unable to harm her icy skin. But as she started to draw heat from the strange little creature, its angry face turned to terror. She stopped absorbing its heat. Even this weird little criminal monster she couldn't bring herself to kill. She didn't ever want another death on her conscience. She drew just enough heat from the creature to weaken it, then did the same to all its companions, but as they dropped one by one, someone beneath must have noticed that his minions were not returning to him. The street beneath Snow suddenly burst open and a towering mole monster emerged, with a short, rotund man in a green cape on its back. Snow had no idea what was going on, but the beast quickly spotted her, still clutching one of the little yellow men, and it thrust its fist down towards her. She instinctively raised her arms, and, surprising even herself, shot a beam of ice, shoving the creature's arm back and freezing it to its own chest. The creature stumbled back, but was about ready to swing its other arm, when a voice called from the air above.
"It's clobbering time!"
A stone-skinned figure smashed down from the air into the beast and hammered it into the streets. A hover car then swirled down from the air, and out came the other members of the Fantastic Four. The youngest and most handsome member, Johnny Storm, looked from the beast's icy arm to Snow and asked, "Did you do that?" Cool stuff. It was a terrible pun, but with how dour Snow's last few days had been, she appreciated the levity. Johnny's entire body suddenly engulfed in flames and he flew off the ground to help his teammate. The four took down the mole man and his monster soon after, and came to speak to Snow to thank her and ask who she was. They could sense her unease, partially elevated by the growing crowd around them, so they brought her back to their base in the Baxter building. She eventually told them everything that had happened, even what she'd done to the AIM agents, and they all assured her that she was not going to get in trouble for it. They said that even if she did feel some guilt over the event, she could just now use her abilities to help people and make sure more good than bad came from her powers while she had them, but also promised to help her find a way to reverse them. In the meantime, they had a surprisingly perfect source of constant heat for her. Johnny, aka the Human Torch, had an overabundance of heat in his body, and no matter how much she absorbed from him, she could never hurt him. All she'd have to do was tolerate his mediocre flirting attempts, which eventually became charming. While the process for curing her was long and ongoing, Caitlin Snow would eventually lose her sense of urgency to get better, as she'd learned to love her life as a hero, fighting alongside New York's favorite super family. On rare occasions when someone is able to sit down with the secretive hero known as the Japester, there is no guarantee they'll hear the true history of how he became who he is today. However, one commonly accepted story that he's told in the past is that he was once a man named Jack Napier, or Arthur Fleck, or Jerome Valeska. I'll stick with Jack for the sake of clarity. Anyway, Jack had quit his job as an engineer to try his hand at being a comedian, but it wasn't going very well for him. With every set he tried, he got more boos and more people walking out, so his confidence plummeted more and more each night. Eventually, some guys who frequently came to rag on his sets found him at the end of a particularly bad show and started telling him about another way he could make some money. They said his shows were never going to start paying off, but at least he could make some cash being their lookout on a little heist they were pulling in Hell's Kitchen. Jack didn't want to be a criminal, but the more they talked, the more convinced he was that it may be the only way he could make some fast cash, which he was in dire need of. He eventually agreed and went with them to the Hell's Kitchen Roxxon plant, and was quickly informed that their plans were already different than he'd thought. He wasn't just going to keep watch outside, he was going in with them. He tried to protest, with concerns about security cameras, but they quickly told him that he was being a baby and just gave him a red mask to put on to cover his face. As a man with rock-bottom confidence at the time, and being desperate for some kind of approval from wherever he could get it, Jack was more easily convinced and went inside. Their target was a vault kept in the back of the plant manager's office, and to get there, the group was creeping along the upper walkways of the plant, high above vats of bubbling chemicals that smelt like death. The group got to the door, opened it up, and immediately heard a cold voice. "I figured you'd show up here." A shotgun blast exploded through the building and the front man dropped in a pool of blood. Stomping out from the dark was a black-clad figure with a white skull on his chest, carrying a whole infantry of guns. Turned out these crooks had done a lot worse stuff than just petty robberies before that night, and had brought onto themselves the wrath of the Punisher. The other two crooks shoved Jack to the ground and sprinted back away from him. Jack tried to get up and run, but quickly had a gun in his face. Jack tore off his mask with tears running down his face, begging, "Please, I barely know those guys, I just needed some money." But the Punisher pulled him close and said, "You work with scum, you are scum." Instead of shooting him, he hurled him over the railing and Jack plummeted 4 stories right into the toxic chemicals below. His skin burned, but he was terrified to swim back to the surface, thinking that he'd just be shot. He stayed under as long as he could bear, then bolted back to the surface. As he hit the air, he tried to breathe in quietly, holding back chokes from the toxic, horrific fumes. Through a haze of his burning eyes, he could see that on the walkway above was a new figure, fighting against the Punisher. He was clad in all red with devil horns spawning from his helmet. The two were arguing as they fought, but the red figure seemed to be trying to both subdue the criminals while also keeping Punisher from shooting them. Jack couldn't make out their whole conversation, but did hear words from the red-clad hero, "Everyone deserves a second chance." That was the last thing Jack really remembered from that night, beyond him climbing out of the vat of chemicals and slinking off into the night to vomit and pass out in an alley. The next day, or possibly days later, Jack awoke. His skin had been bleached white by the chemicals, and his hair a permanent lime green. When he saw his own face in a reflection, the old him likely would have been mortified about what others would say about his appearance. But in that moment, he just found himself laughing. Whether the chemicals had wiped away some of his inhibitions, or he really just had that life-changing of a night, Jack never sunk back into his deeply insecure old self. The main thing ringing through his head for days afterwards was everyone deserves a second chance. That spoke to the core of Jack's being, and it further solidified an obsession with the man that had almost ensured that Jack never got his second chance: the Punisher. If Jack, a down-on-his-luck comedian who'd been goaded in a low moment to help a petty robbery, wasn't worth a second chance, then who else had Punisher killed without so much as a possibility of redemption? Nobody's life should be over just because they had one bad day. Jack then began dedicating his time to tracking and thwarting the Punisher's rampages. He came up with more and more ridiculous and comedic ways of trapping the Punisher, disarming him, then making him watch as the Japester apprehended the criminals himself and made sure they were given a proper trial. Punisher came to despise Jack and would beat him senseless on multiple occasions. But since Jack wasn't doing anything illegal and was in fact apprehending criminals, even the ruthless Punisher couldn't justify killing him. This put them in a perpetual stalemate of the Japester always being willing to get back up to fight for what he believed was right, all while having a little bit too much fun riling up the Punisher in the process. When the soon-to-be leader of the underwater nation of Talokan was born, Namor was quickly seen to be special among his people. A mutant, born with wings on his ankles, pointed ears, would age slower, and was still able to breathe air, while the rest of his people could only absorb oxygen from the seas. He was quickly seen as a gift to their people, but because of this, the Talokan elders urged Namor's mother to bear another child, in the hopes that she could bring them another great hero. While Namor's father had passed away, she agreed to the requests of the elders and bore a child to another man, giving Namor a half-brother named Orm. Unfortunately, while the boy did gain the same extended lifespan, he got no other of the gifts Namor had been born with. While Orm was accepted by his people, he always felt a sense of disrespect as the lesser brother. His people praised Namor as their leader, while Orm was little more than his brother's aide. Namor spent most of his time and energy focusing on the people, and rarely made time for his brother outside of their duties. Eventually, Orm grew jealous enough to seek more power outside the confines of their underwater nation. Without a word, he left Talokan, thinking he'd not be missed, and traveled the ocean seeking knowledge along the shores of the human world. He'd used Talokan technology to venture up onto land for brief periods of time, to seek out texts and knowledge on ways he could potentially enhance his own power. While this was a slow and frustrating search, he had one thing many others didn't: time. He didn't care how long it took. Orm would gain the might he sought and become more worthy as a leader than his brother. Slowly his knowledge grew, and he learned of the sorcerers of Kamartaj. Tibet was too far inland for him to reach, but he was eventually able to steal magical texts from sea-bound sorcerers, and slowly was able to teach himself rudimentary magic. As his skill set grew, he even enchanted a spear from his people that he could then use to control the tides around him. With this, after a few hundred years, he eventually felt powerful enough to return home and challenge his brother, to show his people that he had become a master of the oceans and a truly worthy king of Talokan. He swam back into his underwater nation, expecting for none save his brother to recognize him, as all others who'd known him before would have died, but instead he was met with shock and surprise. He couldn't understand why so many recognized him until he swam into Talokan's throne room and saw, among other statues, was a large stone carving of himself. As he stared at the structure, Namor burst into the chamber and swam like a bolt to his brother and hugged him. He could hardly believe Orm was there. Namor told him how he'd long been considered dead and that he'd missed him dearly. It was a shockingly vulnerable display from the regal king, and Orm was dumbfounded. He wouldn't have thought his brother cared that much. Namor said that while he worked proudly and diligently for their people, it was lonely being the only one who aged so slowly, watching all his loved ones die around him. But not with Orm back by his side. Namor apologized for not paying more attention to his brother while he was around, but promised to do so now that he was back. Orm was astounded, and completely changed his intentions. He didn't confess that he'd sought to overthrow his brother. Instead, he claimed that he'd simply been studying and seeking power from the human world, and then showed off the incredible might of his magic and his tide-turning staff. The kingdom of Talokan celebrated for days on end for Orm's return, and the incredible strength he'd brought to their people. From then on, Orm fought proudly by his brother's side, still not the true leader of the Talokan people, but feeling the sense of true value and appreciation that he'd long been searching for. Okay, so now I've done Marvel heroes as DC villains as Marvel heroes. Next we could do Marvel villains as DC heroes, or DC heroes as Marvel villains, or more of one of these other. Just let me know if you like any other ideas of these pairings in the comments, and give me suggestions of characters you'd like me to use, because these have been really fun for me. Plus, if you're new to the channel, you might want to go back to the Marvel Heroes as DC Villains episode. Or maybe my DC Characters as Dragons video, or anime characters in the Marvel Universe video. I got tons of Marvel and DC stuff on this channel. And if you want to color the inks from this episode yourself and get access to the high-resolution art, you might want to consider supporting the Popcross Studios Patreon, where I put out the high-resolution art and inks from every episode a day before the episode goes out. Plus, you get access to a bonus podcast series where I talk about my art and writing process. But besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note, and the thought I want to leave people with is actually something inspired by something I saw at the gym the other day. A guy had brought his Nintendo DS to play while he was on the treadmill, and I thought, that's kinda clever. I mean, generally speaking, I am more of an advocate for focusing on what you're doing when you're getting exercise and pushing yourself, but if that guy was gonna play an hour of video games anyway, going and doing it on the treadmill is just a good way to make it a slightly healthier habit. I think that's just good inspiration to think about how there might be some creative ways you can take the things that you like doing and just make them into slightly healthier habits. So thank you, treadmill video game guy. I hope that's inspiring, I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Monday.